It began with a single sentence buried deep inside a classified cable delivered not by email, not through official diplomacy, but by hand. A former U.S. military attaché flanked by private American security contractors walked into Ouagadougou before sunrise and placed the envelope directly on Captain Ibrahim Traoré's desk. Inside, a 48-hour ultimatum from then-President Donald J. Trump. The demand was blunt cold and written in the language of empire: hand over 60% of Burkina Faso's newly discovered oil reserves and gold production. Turn over control of national energy policy to an American-led economic board. Allow U.S. corporations to dictate mining routes and exports. In return, protection from sanctions blockades and the unspoken threat of regime change. For a small, landlocked nation in West Africa, this was more than a policy proposal. It was an economic siege weapon delivered in a suit and tie. The subtext was simple: we saved you from terrorism. Now it's time to pay up. But what Trump's team didn't calculate was the man sitting across from that letter. Captain Traoré, a soldier forged in the heat of Burkina Faso's internal battles, was not a politician looking for an easy compromise. He didn't blink. He didn't ask for time. He told his intelligence chief and military commander one thing: tell the Americans Burkina Faso is not for sale. In that moment, the stage was set for one of the most daring acts of defiance Africa has seen in decades, a head-on collision between a young African leader and the world's most powerful nation. The question now is not just whether Traoré can survive this storm, but whether this will ignite a wave of sovereignty across the continent. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about Africa, America, and power. The cable did not arrive by chance. Intelligence sources later confirmed it was planned, deliberate, and meant to send a message. A trusted intermediary, a former U.S. military attaché, was chosen for the delivery. Flanking him were private American security contractors, their presence a reminder that this was not a friendly diplomatic call. When the envelope reached Captain Ibrahim Traoré's desk at dawn, the instructions inside were as clear as they were brutal. The document, labeled Confidential Strategic Resource Acquisition Framework, outlined three primary demands: surrender 60% of all current and future oil production to U.S. oil giants under the guise of stabilization and infrastructure, hand over control of Burkina Faso's gold export routes to U.S.-approved intermediaries, establish an American advisory board with veto power over new mining contracts, revenue distribution, and long-term energy policy. The incentives attached were nothing short of veiled threats, promises of military protection, technology, partnerships, and security cooperation paired with the ominous guarantee of protection from regime change. Anyone familiar with modern geopolitics knows that phrase doesn't promise safety, it's a warning. The timing of this ultimatum was no accident. For months, Burkina Faso had been quietly undergoing a seismic shift. Hidden beneath the dry northern plains, a secret geological survey conducted with Russian engineers, Iranian drones, and North Korean cyber specialists had confirmed massive untapped oil reserves. This discovery came as the government under Traoré's leadership was already reclaiming control over the nation's gold industry. French-controlled mining companies were being phased out, replaced by Burkina military units tasked with securing and managing production. Revenue once flowing to Paris was now redirected into a national development fund. Western intelligence services were quick to notice. Within 48 hours of the first drilling operation, American and French satellites were picking up unusual energy activity in the Sahel. They traced shipments of specialized equipment coming in from Iran and Venezuela. Encrypted communications hinted at a sovereign petroleum corridor, a direct challenge to the global oil order. The U.S. assessment was simple: if Burkina Faso could control its oil and gold without Western oversight, it would set a dangerous precedent for the rest of Africa. That precedent had to be stopped before Mali, Niger, Chad, or even the Congo followed suit. And so the Trump ultimatum was crafted blunt, businesslike, and backed by the full weight of American influence. The expectation in Washington was that Traoré would negotiate compromise or quietly fold. That's how the script had always played out in the past. But this time, the script was about to be torn apart. Traoré read the letter twice, placed it calmly on the table, and looked at his intelligence chief. His words were measured but final. They want 60% of our future. Then they'll get 100% of our resistance. From that moment forward, the machinery of national defense went into motion. Orders were issued to lock down every oil field, double security on gold convoys, and cut all data feeds from foreign contractors. Satellite feeds from Western powers were jammed in certain regions, and preparations began for a televised address to the nation, an address that would not only answer Washington's demands, but signal to the entire African continent that Burkina Faso had chosen its side. The confrontation was no longer a private matter between two leaders. By midday, African media outlets from Lagos to Kinshasa had picked up whispers of the ultimatum. Headlines blared about Trump's demands, Traoré's refusal, and the high-stakes countdown that had just begun. The stage was set. What came next would transform a small West African nation into the center of a geopolitical storm, one that would pit sovereignty against empire in full view of the world. When the clock started ticking on Washington's 48-hour ultimatum, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't retreat to a negotiation table. He stepped into the national spotlight. That afternoon, television screens across Burkina Faso went black for a moment, then flickered to life. There was no polished set, no ceremonial backdrop, just Traoré in full military uniform standing beside the Burkina flag with a single folder in his hand. Across its cover were 3 words stamped in bold red U.S. threat: confidential. His voice was steady, his gaze fixed. To the people of Burkina Faso and to our African brothers and sisters, an offer has been made to sell our oil, to sell our gold, to sell our honor in exchange for fear. To those behind this insult to Mr. Trump and his backers, you have misjudged us. We are not Libya. We are not Iraq. We are not your playground. We will never trade our land for your luxury. We will never bow to your bullets or your banks. You gave us 48 hours. Here's our response. You now have 48 hours to take your greed, your threats, and your arrogance and leave African soil. Then he saluted and walked off camera. No questions, no compromise. Within minutes, the speech was replayed across African news channels, radio stations, and social media feeds. In Bamako, Mali, people poured into the streets waving AES flags. In Conakry, Guinea, murals appeared overnight showing Traoré standing on oil barrels, raising the Burkina flag high. Across Niger, chants of "us or death" echoed through marketplaces. The impact was immediate. Leaders of the AES alliance, Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, General Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger, and Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya of Guinea, flew to Ouagadougou within 48 hours. The world watched as the 4 men emerged from the presidential palace together. Their joint statement was short but seismic. If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch all of us. This was not just solidarity, it was a new security doctrine. AES forces began deploying across the region. Mali sent battle-hardened advisors to guard Burkina Faso's oil fields. Niger installed mobile radar units along the shared border to detect any aerial intrusion. Guinea opened its airspace for emergency supply routes and promised rapid response troops if needed. But the AES wasn't the only reinforcement arriving. The next wave of support came from far beyond Africa. 3 days after Traoré's speech, a quiet Chinese delegation landed in Ouagadougou. No grand speeches, no press conference, just a signed agreement to build a fully operational oil refinery in 90 days, install gold valuation systems that bypass Western banks, and integrate Burkina Faso into China's digital yuan trade network, cutting out both the CFA franc and the US dollar. 24 hours later, a Russian military transport aircraft touched down at a secure airstrip. On board were advanced electronic warfare systems, anti-drone technology, and dozens of unmarked crates labeled specialized defense assets. In plain terms, Burkina Faso's oil infrastructure was now shielded by Russian-grade protection. This flurry of alliances sent Washington into a panic. At ExxonMobil and Chevron headquarters, executives called emergency strategy meetings. In Langley, CIA analysts flagged the AES as a potential hostile defense bloc. The State Department scrambled to reframe the crisis, claiming Trump had acted independently outside official policy. But no one in Africa believed it. The media war began almost instantly. Major Western outlets painted Traoré as reckless, unstable, even dangerous. CNN ran segments warning of humanitarian collapse in Burkina Faso. The BBC claimed the country's isolation would devastate its economy, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, the opposite was happening. Volunteer enlistments surged for oilfield security units. University campuses held public lectures on resource sovereignty. Women's cooperatives delivered food and supplies to soldiers guarding gold convoys. And then the internet fought back. Young Africans remixed CNN's fear-mongering into protest songs. Memes of Traore standing over oil rigs went viral with the caption, "If they hate him this much, he must be doing something right." In Washington, frustration boiled over. Private intelligence firms began flooding Burkina Faso's digital space with fake scandals and smear campaigns. Anonymous sources claimed Traoré was a puppet of Moscow and Beijing. Social media bots amplified these narratives. Yet every attack seemed to strengthen his image at home. By the end of the week, a new reality was clear. The U.S. threat had failed to intimidate Traoré, and worse for Washington, it had united Africa's most defiant leaders into a functioning alliance with global backing. The 48-hour deadline had become something larger than a countdown. It was now the opening chapter in a battle between sovereignty and empire, with Burkina Faso at the center. And for the first time in a long time, Africa was not on the defensive. It was standing tall, looking the world in the eye and saying, "Not this time." The morning after Traoré's televised rejection of the U.S. ultimatum, Ouagadougou woke up to a different kind of energy. It wasn't fear, it was purpose. At the University of Ouagadougou, classrooms turned into open forums. Students gathered not for lectures on mathematics or literature, but to debate the meaning of sovereignty. Professors drew maps of West Africa on chalkboards, explaining how control over resources had shaped and often crippled the continent's history. Outside, the campus walls were covered with fresh graffiti: "Our oil, our gold, our future." In the city's bustling markets, women's cooperatives shifted their focus overnight. Groups that once sold produce and handmade crafts began organizing food deliveries to soldiers stationed at oil fields and guarding gold convoys. "If they protect our wealth," one vendor told a local reporter, "we must protect them." Even in rural villages far from the capital, the ripple effect was visible. Radio broadcasts carried Traoré's speech to communities with no internet access. Elders sat in courtyards repeating his words to younger generations, framing them not as political rhetoric, but as a call to defend dignity. Politically, the government moved with unprecedented speed. Under Traoré's direct order, the National Assembly convened a closed-door emergency session. By unanimous vote, they passed a historic resolution: all oil and gold reserves within the territory of Burkina Faso are hereby nationalized and permanently protected from foreign corporate ownership. The decree came into effect immediately. French and Canadian mining licenses were revoked. U.S.-backed energy survey teams were escorted to the border. Revenue from ongoing gold production was rerouted into the National Development Fund, earmarked for healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The international backlash was swift. Western governments accused Traoré of economic nationalism and warned of severe consequences. The U.S. Treasury quietly explored sanctions. European Union officials began drafting restrictions on Burkina exports. Major Western media outlets intensified their coverage, painting Burkina Faso as a rogue state heading toward collapse. But inside the country, the opposite narrative took hold. Volunteer enlistment surged, not just in the military, but in community watch groups tasked with safeguarding infrastructure. Farmers offered portions of their harvest to feed soldiers. Artisans began producing flags and banners with the AES emblem, which now flew alongside the national flag in many towns. The social fabric, often strained by poverty and insecurity, seemed to tighten. People who once viewed politics with suspicion now saw it as a shared responsibility. In street interviews, ordinary citizens spoke with the kind of conviction usually reserved for national holidays or liberation anniversaries. "I was born when France still controlled our gold," one elderly miner said. "I may die before I see the end of this fight. But for the first time, I believe my grandchildren might work for themselves, not for Paris." Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the political shockwaves were unmistakable. In Bamako, Conakry, and Niamey, leaders praised Traoré's defiance as a model for Africa's future. The African Union, often criticized for its cautious diplomacy, was forced to address the situation in an emergency session. While no formal resolution was passed, the debate marked a rare moment when the question of resource sovereignty took center stage in continental politics. At the grassroots level, the message spread faster than official diplomacy. Hashtags like "Africa is not for sale" and "We are all." Burkina flooded social media across the continent. Diaspora communities in Paris, New York, and Johannesburg organized rallies in solidarity. Outside U.S. embassies in several African capitals, protesters held signs reading, "Touch Traoré, and you touch all of us." For the people of Burkina Faso, the events of those 48 hours had already reshaped the national identity. The country was no longer just a landlocked nation in the Sahel struggling for stability, it was now a symbol of resistance. And for the first time in living memory, ordinary citizens felt they were not just witnesses to history, but active participants in it. In Washington, the Burkina Faso standoff landed like a political grenade. Officially, the White House maintained that Donald Trump, now out of office, had acted independently during his term, that the ultimatum was not a reflection of U.S. foreign policy. But behind closed doors, few were buying that narrative. For decades, American policy toward resource-rich nations had relied on a delicate mix of diplomacy, corporate influence, and quiet coercion. Trump's approach had simply stripped away the subtlety. At the State Department, analysts worried about the Burkina Faso effect, the possibility that Traoré's defiance could inspire a domino chain of resource nationalism across Africa. Think tanks began hosting emergency panels on strategic mineral security, a term that thinly veiled the fear of losing control over Africa's gold, oil, uranium, and rare earths. Over at the Pentagon, the conversation was less about economics and more about influence. Burkina Faso was part of the Sahel, a region where U.S., French, and other Western forces had long justified their presence under the banner of counterterrorism. If AES nations closed their borders to Western military operations, it could dismantle years of strategic positioning in one of Africa's most resource-rich corridors. American media largely framed Traoré as a destabilizing force. CNN warned of economic collapse and regional instability. Fox News took a different angle, portraying him as a proxy for Russia and China. The underlying message in both narratives was the same: Burkina Faso's sovereignty push was dangerous because it was outside the Western sphere of control. But the view from other capitals told a different story. In Moscow, state media hailed Traoré as a patriot of the global South. Beijing's coverage emphasized mutually beneficial development and showcased the refinery and payment systems promised to Burkina Faso. In Latin America, outlets in Venezuela and Bolivia openly compared Traoré's stand to their own battles against U.S. economic influence. Even in Europe, cracks appeared in the United Front. While France's political class openly condemned Burkina Faso's actions, some EU lawmakers, particularly from southern and eastern member states, questioned whether continued confrontation was wise, especially as African markets began shifting trade toward BRICS partners. On the global stage, the symbolism was potent. For nations long accustomed to accepting Western demands in exchange for aid or protection, Burkina Faso had broken the mold. The message was not simply that a small African country could say no, but that it could do so and rally both regional allies and major world powers to its side. In many ways, this was the real threat to the established order, not the loss of oil or gold, but the loss of the old playbook. And as policymakers in Washington quietly admitted to one another, once that playbook stops working in one place, it's only a matter of time before others try the same. The dust had barely settled when the world realized this was no ordinary diplomatic skirmish. Burkina Faso had not only rejected one of the most direct ultimatums ever delivered by a U.S. president, it had done so publicly without compromise and with a defiance that echoed far beyond its borders. For the people of Burkina Faso, those 48 hours became a defining chapter in their national story. For Washington, it was a wake-up call that the old levers of power threats, sanctions, and promises of protection no longer guaranteed compliance. But history warns us when smaller nations defy powerful empires, the confrontation rarely ends with the first victory. Pressure shifts form. Economic isolation, disinformation campaigns, covert destabilization, all can follow. And while Burkina Faso now stands on the shoulders of allies in the AES, China, and Russia, the reality is that the road ahead will be long, hard, and relentless. Across Africa, the question has already spread. If Burkina Faso can reclaim its resources and survive, why can't we? It's a question that unsettles not only Paris or Washington, but every capital whose influence relies on Africa's minerals, oil, and strategic geography. This is why the stakes are no longer just about one country's gold and oil. They're about whether an entire continent can redefine its relationship with the world. For Americans, especially those who remember the long Cold War and its endless proxy conflicts, this moment carries a familiar tension. The rhetoric is different, but the playbook feels the same: secure resources, protect influence, and frame resistance as instability. But perhaps for the first time in generations, we are watching the script being rewritten, not by superpowers, but by nations once dismissed as powerless. And so the warning is clear: what happened in Ouagadougou will not remain in Ouagadougou. The struggle over who controls Africa's wealth is intensifying, and its outcome will shape not only the future of the continent, but the balance of global power for decades to come. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet, or should Africa prepare for an even bigger confrontation ahead? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, because the next chapter in this story may be even more explosive than the last.